So join me in welcoming our president.
Thank you very much. I'm very honored to be here, and I'm very pleased to see that so many of you came out to the last session after a very full 3 days of a conference. This has been a wonderful conference, and I think the quality of papers is higher every year I come to it. I am very conscious of being the barrier between you and a really nice banquet tonight. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about the tone of this presentation, and if I got it wrong, I do apologize. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time telling you funny stories, but before I get to them, I do want to make it clear that I have a serious point today. And so if you can bear with me through the next 4 or 5 slides, I'm going to give you my take-home message. What we know very little about is how the economic ideas of ordinary people develop. And I have to apologize to David Levy because he actually has a book by that title, The Economic Ideas of Ordinary People. But we really don't know where they come from. We really don't know what kind of a worldview is operating in people's minds, how people think about the world they live in. It's ordinary people that are responsible for zombie policies and zombie economics. What do we mean by that? If you spend time as a policymaker, you spend a lot of time trying to put to death wrong ideas, trying to wipe out foolish ideas. And I'm not talking about ideology here. I'm talking about the kind of ideas that economists across the spectrum would see as just error. So you spend time trying to wipe out error, and occasionally you succeed, and then 6 months later, the same idea reemerges in a slightly different form. And you call in all your cohorts, and you spend a lot of time trying to beat down that error again, and maybe it'll work, but 3 months later, that same idea will reemerge. But the real reason we have to know something about how ordinary people form their ideas about the economy is because they become very vulnerable to economic charlatans, to people who can cause a great deal of damage. So what I'd like to do is to talk about some of the examples of the divergence between ideas of economists and conventional wisdom. But why do we need to understand folk wisdom? We need to understand folk wisdom to make better predictions about human behavior, to avoid unintended consequences in the case of policy interventions, to communicate better, to enhance economic literacy, and finally, to reduce the vulnerability of the voting public to economic cranks. And philosophers for 2,000 years have been rather confused about a lot of things. They were confused about sex, they were confused about gender roles, about reproduction, and in general about the nature of society, both human society and apian society. So this is my 2,000-year-long story of how human beings have portrayed the societies in which we live in the context of the beehive. But what I'd like to do is to talk a little bit about the ordinary people of the period, and that is the European farm wives who were responsible for beekeeping over much of this period. These examples are from the years 800 and 900, and you'll forgive me, I hope. These are much more elegant in German, but I only have the English translation. So from Austria, we have the statement, "Humble little bee, little womb mother." From Switzerland, "I bid thee, mother of bees, by God, King of heaven, not to rise up on high. I have prepared thee a good hive." So we've got these little charms from ordinary people 500 years, 600 years before scientists have discovered that we're dealing with kings, queens, and not kings. This is a time when the philosophers are talking about the king of the bees. Ordinary people who are keeping bees are suddenly talking about the mother of the bees. Why does any of this matter? I think the point I've been trying to make is that if we don't understand how ordinary people understand economic relations, we risk misinterpreting behavior and imagining market imperfections that don't exist. Again, why does any of this matter? This guy's playing whack-a-mole. And I come back to the point I began with at the beginning. How can we hope to communicate if we don't understand how ordinary people characterize economic relations and the world in which they live? The best you can do is to beat down arguments as they appear. But if you get a better understanding, I think, of how ordinary people develop economic ideas, then you can address your economics accordingly. When we think about the way ordinary people think of the economy, we tend to think that they really have no ideas about the economy at all, or if they do, they're sort of disjointed and inconsistent ideas about the way the economy functions. And I don't think that's true at all. I think one of the reasons we have so much difficulty teaching economics to people who've not studied economics and for whom economics is not a second language is that their heads are already absolutely full of economic models. They're not the same as the economic models we deal with. The vaccination example is exactly where this came from. Many of my colleagues are engaged in exactly the process that I'm suggesting, and that is trying to understand the worldviews of people of the anti-vaccination crowd. And they're not simple, and they're not uniform, and you have very different groups out there who are making different kinds of arguments.